If I had to say there's one theme on this show over the past few months or so, it's what does tech collaboration look like in practice? I mean, is collaboration just lip service, or will it lead to real outcomes? Is it an actual business strategy? You've heard about this from Lawrence King, from Claudia Roessler, from Mark Pendergrast, from Jim Ethington last week, and others all talking about this. Today, we hear from another leader who has proven experience in agtech collaboration, Jeff Schreiner.
What we believe is the right way to go, which is ask the consumer what they really want, ask the market what it really wants, and then deliver something to the market that's consumable. But data and data sharing solves sustainability issues, optimization issues, decision-making issues, traceability. I mean, you name it. If we can get more transparent, we're going to get faster at solving those big issues. The product that's produced that has data that enhances that product ultimately creates a way to grade that product and become a variable pricing mechanism at some point in time.
Jeff is the Vice President of Global Collaboration at Cultura Tech, a company that has acquired other tech companies focused on agriculture across the value chain. Today, Jeff is interviewed by guest co-host Rhishi Pethe about collaboration, data, regulation, and the future of agriculture. Hello, fellow ag nerds. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture podcast. My name is Tim Hamrich, and every week you and I get to hear from the founders, farmers, innovators, and investors, the people shaping the future of the ag industry. And I'm very excited to have another episode by a guest co-host. And I don't know how long we should call him a guest co-host, how many episodes it takes before we drop the guest moniker to that. But Rhishi Pethe is back on the show. Rhishi, thank you so much for bringing another episode to the Future of Agriculture.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, for continuing to give me the opportunity to guest host these episodes. They've been a lot of fun. And this one was particularly interesting, and we can talk about why we thought this would be an interesting episode.
Yeah. Before we get there, though, I want to hear about Metal Dog Labs. So we talked maybe the first time you guest hosted about what you were doing, going out on your own. I'd like to hear the type of projects that you're working on and how that's going for you.
Yeah, I think it's going reasonably well. What I do is I provide product and technology strategy to agri-food companies. And a lot of my work has been with startups. I've lately started working with investor groups, VCs, etc. And that has been typically around, hey, where do you think this space is going? Or how should we think about this particular area, whether it's a landscape map or, hey, we have these companies that we think we want to invest in. Can you give your product and technology lens on these companies? But it has been interesting, especially on the startup side, given the current funding environment.
Yeah, it is. It's been a challenge. I kind of rode the high of World Agritech for a while and sort of coming down off of that and trying to figure out kind of what's going on out there. Obviously, the funding environment is tough, but it also just feels like some general stagnation out there. I don't know. We go through these waves, obviously, and probably in all of tech of like where everything seems to be happening at once, and then it feels like maybe a period of stagnation. But how's it feel from your side? What are some of the challenges out there other than the obvious funding challenge? But what are you hearing?
Yeah, I think a lot of companies are focusing on near-term revenue and finding product market fit or making it stronger. And a lot of companies are saying, hey, we need to survive till 25. Like that's a line I've heard quite a bit from different folks. And so they're making slightly different decisions when it comes to how they're managing their business. Obviously, they're going very tight on their cash burn. They are looking at how and where they want to spend money, and they're taking very close look at hiring. If you have some product market fit, then people are willing to hire salespeople because then that can get you more revenue coming in the future or in the near term. If you're not there, then you are really buckling down on near-term projects. You are saying, hey, this is an interesting project, but it's long-term. We don't want to spend any money on it. And they're also willing to work with part-time folks like me who can come in a surgical fashion and give them some specific advice versus hiring somebody full-time.
Survive until 2025. That makes a lot of sense given kind of the tone that I'm feeling out there from the various people I've been talking to. One interesting development in recent years, and this isn't brand new, but something that I've been watching is these companies that seem to be buying up some of the smaller software companies to make a I don't know what the right term is, conglomerate, umbrella company. And that's one of the things we're featuring here today on this episode, which is Cultura Tech. Also, EverAg has been on the show. They're kind of another one doing the same thing. What do you think of this strategy? Does it make a lot of sense given the fact that valuations probably aren't as high as they were a few years ago for these types of companies?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting strategy. And you probably see this more, especially in the times that we're in, because if you have companies which are in distress in terms of, their financial health, they become good targets for a larger company to buy up and maybe create more of an end-to-end offering, or maybe use that as a customer acquisition strategy. And then if you can get a group of these things together, and I'm not saying this is exactly what Cultura is doing, but if you can get a group of these companies together, you can probably run them more efficiently as a group, because you can take out some of the redundant functions in there and maybe generate some cash flow. So and I've seen this, I've heard this even at a much smaller scale where, there are a lot of these smaller family-run services businesses, right? Maybe they're making $500,000 revenue, and maybe the founder wants to retire or they don't have the funds to expand. Then somebody bigger can come in and maybe buy up 10 of these for not a whole lot of money, and use those funds to expand and generate more cash flow, right? So this seems like, probably my guess is we're going to see more of this, if not we're already seeing it over the coming months.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, and probably a good time to frame up the guest that we're talking about here today. And you talk about, who we're having on the show today. He's from, I'll just give it away, he's from Cultura Tech, which is one of these companies that own several software type companies. But talk about who we have on the show today.
Yeah, so we have Jeff on the show. He works as SVP of Collaboration, which is an interesting title. I've not seen that a whole lot before. And so that's what piqued my interest. And given Jeff's background, he was at a couple of companies like Schreiner, which does a lot of post-harvest management of grain. He also ran a logistics company, which came out as a collaboration across these different companies. And then Cultura Tech, they're an interesting organization. They're part of a larger group, and they buy a lot of companies, and their philosophy is to find the right assets and buy and hold. It looks like they've never really sold a company that they've bought, which is sort of amazing to think about. And so it's a very different approach compared to what you see in sort of traditional, VC world. And so that's what piqued my interest, to say, hey, okay, you guys seem to be trying to do something different. And even though we talk a lot about collaboration within the industry, like, I haven't seen anybody have that formal title. So I was curious, what does that really mean in terms of, day-to-day job, and how does that create value for your organization?
Right. Yeah, I mean, listeners will be familiar with some of the places, Jeff has worked, and he'll go into more detail on it. But places like Ardent Mills, ConAgra, Schuyler, and then that logistics company you mentioned, which is Roger, which was sold to another one of these companies, EverAg, in August, and then Jeff has just been with Cultura here this year, so I think less than 6 months now. Well, with that, let's drop into the conversation between Rhishi and Jeff Schreiner of Cultura Tech.
My experience has been kind of up and down the supply chain. I worked at a company called ConAgra Foods. ConAgra was really good because they understood the consumer side of the equation. I worked at Ardent Mills. Ardent Mills was really good because the whole company was a very large joint venture that was based on a really good set of values that it was built around, and it was formed under the right premise of what they were trying to do for the industry. And then with Schuyler, the whole premise of that business, they have this entrepreneurial spirit and how they get those problems solved. So what excites me is I think the industry recognizes that if collaboration is going to net us some really good outcomes, they're willing to commit. And in all of those experiences, I've seen indications of a desire to really start to get there. And then agriculture, unlike other industries, really is pretty transparent. Agriculture has to be predicated on co-opetition. You have to have a direct and fundamental relationship with companies and essence of entities that are in similar roles. So you have to have a relational dynamic there, which does set the stage for good collaboration. We just have to think about it differently. They only collaborated in one aspect. We're going to try to collaborate to the goodness of all. So the most exciting part about me is I think the table was set for this new change. I think digital business is coming into our space, and there are lots and lots of technology outlets for solving some problems if we can get the problems defined from this interaction with the industry. So the table set, and that was really the predicate of how we ended up forming a company called Roger. We got competitors together. They all expressed some desire to solve a problem in the bulk freight side, and they decided that one investment in the technology is the better outcome than all try to do it independently. And the customers on the other side, the carriers, were unwilling to say we're going to adopt 7 technologies. We need one, and we're only going to get one.
Yeah. No, I think maybe what we could do is just to maybe dig even one level deeper, given your personal experience with Rogers and how you brought together, you mentioned Anderson, Cargill, Consorted Grain, Coke Fertilizer, Schooler, Bushel, like a bunch of different companies doing completely different, well, not completely, but slightly different things. Could you walk us through that process a little bit? Like, what was the thought process like? How did you get those companies to collaborate and have common incentives? I think a real example from which you have worked on and we're very close to would be very useful for the listeners.
Yeah, and why did those companies get together? I mean, they all had different lenses, Cargill, Anderson's, Schooler, CGB, Coke, Ag and Energy Services, and Bushel all were looking at similar problems through a broad lens of, we think we have this issue because it's a very fragmented truck carrier environment that we live in, 50 to 70,000 bulk truckers in the U.S. They all do business in different ways. These are mostly proprietorships. And so it's a dealing with a problem, and they were all trying to figure out that same issue. So what ran that whole environment was emails and texts and phone calls and spreadsheets and all the businesses. If we ask those questions in a microcosm, they'd all say the same thing. It's like we've got to do something different than we've done in the past because it's getting more and more complex. And it really got complex as we lived through the hiccup of supply chain instability, where we started to see carriers leaving the market, drivers leaving the market, and it became really constrained. So this happened right before all that. So oddly enough, we didn't know that was going to happen, but obviously it was helpful when we digitized something that was, right prior to that problem solved. So that group got together, put aside what they would say is the history of challenges. Agriculture, if there's goodness in agricultural collaboration, it's the fact that if you talk to anybody in the industry, it's really a pretty small knit family. It's a huge industry, but a really small family. So you could talk to anybody and they could be open and they would know all the players and they have relationships and history. The challenging side is that history sometimes sticks. If you've ever had an issue somewhere along the line, it sticks. So that was the history. And when you bring companies like that together, they got all kinds of history, some of them hundreds of years of history. And you have to break down those barriers and let them forget some of that history to prevent them from getting sideways about what they're really there to solve that problem. And so bringing a group like that together was good because they could align on the problem. It was really good because we chose people that could forget any of that history and really get together and say, we're going to attack that problem, and we're all in on it. And we're not in on it just to have the benefit go to us. We're in it so the mission would support the industry. It was exactly what we would love to see across the board in lots and lots of ways, where you can get a group like that. They can say, we got to do better with our interaction with our carriers. And there's other technologies there too. Let's be okay with all those other options. Let's just assume that if we start using technology and we have millions of loads, then others will start using technology in similar ways so that we can all benefit from the efficiencies gained and in some cases better decisions that are gained because we've done that. We've put forth our best efforts to really go after something in that way. And I think that model is workable for us. I think that model saying, let's get industry players, Let them align on the issue. Let them forget some histories that prevent that or concern or resolve risks or any of that stuff. And let's really get after the problem. This is very similar to other industries that went through this change too. We're just on the early side of it. So, we borrowed thinking patterns that came from the financial industry. Financial industry started to transform in the 90s, right? They started going, we need standard transactions and standard data sets. And, eventually, why are we, we're calling other banks to see if we've got a problem on our hands. That started to evolve and then was really elevated, when financial crisis happened in the early 2000s. And they're like, okay, now we have to have a new model altogether different than we used to have it before. And that's where a lot of the standardization, all that data sharing happened. And a lot of these big entities, brokerage houses and banks, put aside what they would have viewed as competitive juices and assets and said, let's just say we're going to get better benefit by aligning on standard. You could say the same thing about healthcare. You can go to any doctor. Why can the doctors can know all your records if you're okay with sharing it through the HIPAA standards? Why can't agriculture solve the same problem that was solved in other industries, maybe even borrow some of the techniques that they use to get there?
Yeah, I think maybe given we're talking about technology, I want to dig a little bit deeper into the tech angle and what are some of the business models that might evolve because of tech and vice versa, right? And depending on who you talk to, there is a theme or undercurrent that the agriculture industry lags behind other industries in technology adoption. That you mentioned, HIPAA standards, you mentioned sort of finance, etc. So one, do you think that characterization is accurate? And if yes, what are some examples? And if not, what are some examples?
I would say it's not a correct characterization that agriculture won't adopt technology or just stands up and resists it. Some of the most entrepreneurial, tech-savvy folks I've ever seen are working in our industry, and they know how to solve problems, and they, in some cases, have solved problems that seemingly were super complex. So I don't think it's that. I think the lagging part or the model that I think is going to help us push through some of that is, again, compartmentalizing those issues very succinctly and saying, here is the thing that we can get behind and go after that. Even though you're letting all kinds of other real opportunities may sit on the table, I do think that is one of the predicates of getting started is you got to do that. There used to be a phrase that my grandfather used to use all the time, and he used to say, just get me some duct tape and baling wire. And, for all intents and purposes, we probably solved problems with two tools that most people thought were probably not, were not solvable. And I think in this case, you make simple, basic investment on duct tape and baling wire first to try it out. That model tells you exactly what you need to know, and then build the robustness and the resiliency and everything else when you know that you have something that's going to stick and actually be aligned with the majority of where people want to go.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an interesting comment. So what you're saying is, can we design low-cost experiments, the duct tape and wire? I'm assuming that's an experiment. And how do we design those experiments? And how do we do that in a collaborative fashion? They are low lift, low cost, and they help us learn. And then we use that learning to design a better, more robust solution, which can create more value. And I think, given sort of you mentioned finance and retail and, medical field, what are some of those low-cost experiments that these other industries have run and learned from it that you think we can bring to this space?
So let's take the example of healthcare. I think healthcare was troubled by the fact that they couldn't provide good outcomes when they didn't have the whole record of a person when they needed to go and treat them. And so the government stepped in and tried to create portability standards. HIPAA, HIPAA, Health Information Portability Accountability Act, really set the framework. It seemed uber complex, hundreds of pages of regulations. I think a lot of folks in that space were just absolutely confounded by how in the world we've made all these investments in all these technologies. They're great technologies, but now they want us to port it over into something, for another purpose altogether we didn't even think about when we did these systems. And the reality was the problem they looked at, the solve started saying, we don't need to solve all of the different attributes of every potential sharing angle. We just need to have a single data backbone. So if we create a backbone that we can tap into, let each business figure out how best to assimilate that data into their own processes and create better outcomes for a patient. Same basic premise, I think, that we're going to have too in agriculture. Maybe we don't have to solve everything from agronomy, detailing, compliance to GREET standards to, upstream trade rule dynamic changes or regulatory pressures. Maybe what we need to do is just start simple and say, we're okay with creating one single sharing mechanism across the board. We're all going to line around that, somehow. And then the outcomes will kind of be a byproduct of a basic solve like that. I think it's, the financial world was the same thing. You had like lots and lots of integrations to markets. And, that was really where in the financial world, remember there was a day when somebody, your financial advisor would show up at your house to have coffee with you one morning and say, here's where you should make investments. Then I'd go back off and I'm going to enact these trades on your behalf, and then they would go make these changes in your financial world. And the reality was, they all thought that because they could integrate a certain way, that was their value proposition. But their value proposition wasn't really the integration. It was really good advice. And so I think that the same basic issue is in our space too. We get that, like financial world solve the sharing problem, and then E-Trade stands up and Charles Schwab and all those different trading houses. Then people, they can make a lot of their trade. Some of them need real good financial advice. Everyone still needs to do better planning, but it's not going to be the access and the execution and the trade itself that makes the difference. And I think that might be one of our issues too, is we shouldn't be hanging our hat on, well, I got this special technology that, is better than someone else's down the street. I think we just got to be better at the planning side of things.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thought process there, because I think that could force different companies and organizations to really think hard about what is the real value add that they're bringing to the table and how do they enhance that. And there are things which they're doing from a supporting standpoint, which could be shared and collaborated on. And that lifts all boats, right? And it improves the customer experience as well. I mean, within agriculture, people have talked about data standards for quite some time. There's the Ag Gateway, ADAPT framework. There are a bunch of other things out there. And I've read a comic where it says, hey, somebody says, I want to create a data standard. He says, okay, that is standard number 14. You already have 13 standards. Like, what is your reaction to that? I mean, are you saying we need to solve the standards problem, or do we need to solve the infrastructure backbone problem, or both? Like, could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll always lay back on, let's let the industry tell us where the real issue is. I think that's great that somebody's done a lot of work. Those organizations have done some phenomenal work to really align on how best the standard is created, what the standard is, and the execution and the usage of that standard is still the question mark in a lot of cases. And that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means that, we started making some investments. Those are really good ground setting activities and probably absolutely mandatory work. But really the problem, if you don't have the business problem that you're trying to solve, you're creating standards for the giant issue. Let's pick the business problem that we want to get after and carve out that standard that everybody can get their mind around, then carve out the how we're going to use it. And again, it doesn't mean it has to be ultimately one solve. And it just may mean that this is the right way that we're going to align around a standard. And this is back to your earlier comment too. I do think that if you look at like manufacturing, manufacturing 4.0 came out. It was a massive book of standards on how manufacturing and traceability are going to be put in place. But that wasn't what they solved in the first pass or two. They just solved, we don't know where our supply chain materials are coming from. Let's figure that problem out first. So they use that standard, and then they use the rest of the framework of manufacturing 4.0 to solve all kinds of different problems. And I think it's similar where Ag Gateway or others, set that table. Let's let the industry figure out how best to leverage them, and let's get a how and a prototype worked out, get some momentum, and then it'll build the rest of the way out.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I also worked in the logistics space for many years, and there were EDI standards, right? And I'm putting double air quotes here. People cannot see that on the audio. And when I first thought it's a standard, I thought there was a standard way to do things, but there were like so many different variations. But at the same time, at a very high level, people agreed on certain things, and that created value in terms of, send a 214 on status, or 204, sorry, on status updates, or 856 on advanced shipment notification, right? And I think that's a good parallel to learn from, though I still struggle to figure out like how will that happen, and hopefully you with your work can help us figure that out. I mean, one follow-up question I've been thinking about is like, who is the right entity or a set of entities to push for this type of a project or an approach, right? Like in the example of HIPAA, you said the government stepped in and said these are the standards, and how that came about was a little bit different. Or even in the case of the Produce Traceability Initiative, right, on the fresh produce side, this was when we had all the spinach problems in the late 2000s, and then Walmart and all these retailers, they said, hey, we need every produce shipment that comes to us to be PTI label compliant. And sort of that drove a change throughout the supply chain. What is the sort of equivalent thing in agriculture? And does the fact that Cultura is more towards sort of post-harvest, closer to the end consumer, the processor or the CPG, like, does that give you a unique advantage in trying to drive collaboration, or it doesn't matter?
Well, Cultura has businesses on the front side of that too. So we have agronomic businesses. So that doesn't do anything other than it gives us a purview and relational capital up and down that whole supply chain. I do think that there's, again, we're looking into a crystal ball. And I think those two examples, in both cases, the HIPAA example, the government wasn't necessarily telling them how to solve the problem, but it was a trigger, It was a trigger for then the industry to respond to, and it was a rallying point. And I think my personal opinion is we don't want the government telling us how to solve the problem. We just need to help us say that there's a fundamental reason for focusing in this particular area. And in some cases, what we don't want to do is have them imbalance the marketplace by saying, we care so much, we want you to do it this way, regardless of something else. So in the HIPAA standard, that was the trigger. And then the industry got together and did the how, and they did a pretty darn good job. From the insurance company to the hospitals to the banks to the dentists, they all pretty much figured out once HIPAA, was in place. The better example, I think, was where the industry, knew the problem was there, and or had a consumer telling them this is what we really, really want. And so the market actually drove the behavior pattern. That is the better example where you've got the marketplace. You want to go buy strawberries. My 20-something-year-old kids all care about a marketplace where they know where their food came from. And when they could go to the grocery store and pull a phone out and look at a QR code and see a picture of the farm, and they thought, well, that was worth $1 more for the strawberries I'm going to buy. That is a perfect example where the industry said, we want to solve the problem. We want our consumers to be happy. If that's the way they're going to be happy, let's do it. And so I think that's two competing examples, one and the other. Both of them have a triggering point. One is the consumer, which is what we believe is the right way to go, which is ask the consumer what they really want, ask the market what it really wants, and then deliver something to the market that's consumable. Regulations are starting to come into play. That should be a trigger point for us too. We know we're going to have to do some compliance. I spent some time with the tomato processors forum, and they're struggling to figure out how to comply with, a lot of the new standards in that world. And so both of them, if we're doing this right, we're looking at the triggers. We're using that as a way to be proactive and say, okay, the triggers happen. Now let's ask the question. Now let's prioritize the question. Now let's really enact something that's going to be useful to the industry. But predominantly, we want the market to be the driving force for what the how is, the how and the consumable portion of the solve is going to look like.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to my next question. Again, personal opinion, I'm not a big fan of regulation, and it can act as a trigger point sometimes. I mean, you mentioned sort of Driscoll strawberries, right? In the late 2000s and the early 2010s, I was very much at the forefront of putting that traceability in place through PTR labels for Driscoll's. And again, it was driven by a demand that, hey, our customer will not accept our product unless we do this, right? What are some of the things that you're hearing from your customers or your collaborators' customers and from the marketplace, as you called it, is, hey, we need your help. You guys, Jeff and who are Dave, I'm just making a name here at some other company. You guys need to talk together, work together so that you solve this problem for me. Like, what are some of the problems that you're hearing from the marketplace?
Basic problems are data sharing. If you can share data, you can, one, report on the data for compliance purposes or other purposes, or a board's initiative has decided that they really want to hear an answer about a certain topic. And once I have the data from my partners as well as me, I now have a much better avenue to do that. And two, when someone says optimization, I mean, we have a world of optimization examples out there. We produce product that's not being used and thrown away. We move product in 2 or 3 ways that may not be the most efficient way to get it to the right consumer. We're maybe making instinctual decisions around where the markets, where the flow of goods are going to. And I think that optimization, which is let's look at that as a holistic picture and let's say, can we optimize? Can we take less steps out of the process? Can we use the data that people are willing to share to get to the right outcomes? I think is a really, really good premise. And even in the setting up of these circles, again, we're really early on this, and I'm very early on this particular role. But in general, every conversation I've had has started with some semblance of, can you get these groups to do this for me? Can we share this data somehow? Can we solve that problem? That seems to be a foundational problem solve for any of the industry issues that are really driving some of the priorities right now. If we look at that, we have to realize that some of these other industries have already gone through it. If we can borrow something from another industry, great. Let's short circuit the whole lesson learning process and go right to something that another industry's figured out. But data and data sharing solves sustainability issues, optimization issues, decision-making issues, traceability. I mean, you name it. If we can get more transparent, we're going to get faster at solving those big issues.
Yeah. And hearing from the marketplace, we talked about other entities within the value chain, whether it's the bank or the tomato grower that you're talking about. What are some of the other feedback that you're hearing from the farmers themselves? I mean, tomato grower is a farmer, and I know you guys work a lot in commodity row crops as well. Like, what are you hearing from the farmers saying, like, hey, again, Jeff and our fictional Dave, you need to collaborate because I have this problem, and if you work together, you'll solve this problem.
Yeah, well, I would say the farmer conversations we had today, you start with what's the impact to me? What's the, what does that mean? I think there's both optimism and an agreement that technology can solve problems, but there's also a healthy degree of skepticism too, which is how many times are you going to ask me for data? And what does this mean? And how does it help me produce and grow better product and market it better and those kinds of things? And so we have to have a really clear, concise avenue for these entrepreneurial farmers that really want answers that way. And what we also don't want to do is, again, you got a situation in Europe where some of those farmer practices rolled out that are unhelpful to farmers. And I think they want to make sure that if you're sharing data, it's going to be done in a very ethical, business-minded way. And so that's a part of the story. Long-term premise, I do believe that when we look at what data can do in our industry, the product that's produced that has data that surrounds it, that enhances that product, ultimately creates, a way to grade that product and become a variable pricing mechanism at some point in time. So data enhanced grades is a premise that I think is going to play out in our industry. And I think we're already starting to hear that. We're seeing the farmers start to recognize that if they do certain things and use certain treatments, at some point there is a different pricing model for that type of pattern than something else. It's not just instincts. You really progressive thinkers like that see 2 or 3 years down the line that these investments they're making can be augmented if we help them to pass that information upstream. and then ultimately to the consumer.
Yeah. Maybe last question here before we wrap up. What are you going to do in the next 6 months to uncover and listen to the market and figure out what those problems are? What is your approach going to be?
We've got about 5 to 7 of these industry circles that are in different states of formation. And so the next 6 months, our first goal would be to get them plugged in, get contributions made, set the rules of interaction. I mean, these are industry circles for really good influential type people, but we also need some rules there too, because they're being built for the goodness of the industry. And I think some of that stuff, we need to set some foundational stuff around it and then let those agendas. So 5 to 8 months, circles, industry assessments, and then priorities around those. And again, I still think the usage and sharing of data seems like a pervasive problem for any of the industry problems I'm hearing. It's like, well, my partner doesn't share that data, so I don't know how I'm going to get this. I think that's a solvable issue. And I bet you we'll have a lot more insight in 5 months than we do today on that topic.
Cool. Well, Jeff, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to wish you the best of luck. You're going to set the rules, set up the infrastructure to bring these things together and hopefully collaborate with more and more people to solve some of these problems.
Rhishi, always great to talk to you. Thanks for the invite.
All right, well, that is going to do it for today's episode. Thank you very much to Jeff Schreiner of Cultura Tech for being on the show. Certainly, you can go learn more about their portfolio companies, if you call them that. They're the companies under their umbrella that they own at their website, which is just culturatech.com. I will link to that in the show notes. A couple interesting call-outs from today's episode. Number one is this strategy of buying these technology companies and trying to bring them together and leverage any sort of synergies and collaborations that might be possible. Obviously, Cultura is doing it. We mentioned Everag at the top of the show also doing it. I'm sure there are some others out there that I'm less familiar with, but certainly an interesting and timely strategy given the funding environment that we are in today. Also, this is going to sort of put a bookend on this conversation about data sharing and collaboration in ag tech. I know we've definitely been talking about this topic quite a bit in recent months. I think it's an important one, and I think through Headstorm and through Microsoft and Bayer and some of the other people we talked to, and of course today with Jeff, we did a good job of exploring this topic, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it. You can always find me on Twitter at Tim Hamrich or via LinkedIn DM. Also want to thank Rhishi Pethe, as always, for coming on and doing a great job with this interview. I'm excited for his next one that's coming up in just a couple months. Last but never least, thank you for your time and your attention. I do not ever take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.